بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
This is the Raising Mums podcast. My name is Gemma Elizabeth, and in this new season of the show, I'll be interviewing Muslim women who are striving to raise the name of Allah and serve the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in their own unique ways, using their God-given talents, inshallah. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. In a UK study in 2020, Muslims from various backgrounds were interviewed, and 82% said they had witnessed anti-black racism from family and friends. 82%! Now, I think we can all agree that that isn't right. It isn't the way that the Ummah should be. It isn't the way that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam taught us to be as communities and as societies. But as mothers, we mustn't underestimate our roles in shaping the minds and the hearts of the next generation coming through, so that they can be free from this systemic illness, from this racism that we witness in society, so that they can see truth as truth really is. Today on the show, I welcome Rukayat Yakub, a Montessori teacher, an award-winning author, mashallah, who has travelled around the world studying Arabic and traditional Islamic sciences, and now, mashallah, she is pursuing a doctorate in Islamic leadership. She's coaching leaders and mothers, who she very rightly points out are leaders in their homes, on how to navigate anti-blackness, which she defines as the inability to see and value black humanity. Now, this might sound like a really heavy episode. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But Sister Rukayat shares so many gems and wisdom and practical advice for you to implement in your home with your kids. So you'll want to listen to the end. Assalamu alaikum, Sister Rukayat. Welcome to the show.
Wa alaikum assalam rahmatullah. Thank you. Such an honor to be here.
SubhanAllah, you are tackling really big issues, mashallah. Anti-blackness is pervasive. It's been described by many as systemic. And yet you have chosen, mashallah, to do something about this. Many a person, when they're faced with such a huge issue, such a huge problem, not just in the home, but in society, they would say, it's too big. It's too big for me. And then, subhanAllah, they just leave it at that. But you haven't done that. You've chosen to do something, mashallah. I want to just ask, what was it that made you feel like you wanted to do something? What made you feel like your work was needed in the world?
SubhanAllah, that's a great question, mashallah. I would say, one of the things is just seeing what our deen teaches about dignity, the dignity that every human being has been blessed with, has been given by Allah Ta'ala. It's not something that we as individuals give to other human beings. It's something that Allah Ta'ala has indeed given us. In the Quran, we're told, وَلَقَدْ كَرَمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ. That Allah Ta'ala has indeed ennobled the children of Adam. And just recognizing that within our deen, we have so many tools for dealing with social issues generally. And we say this all the time, almost like a slogan, Islam is the solution. The reality is we do have these. The challenge, though, is we put them into practice. And as I read, for example, I read the Seerah, I see the examples of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, I read the Shama'il and his character traits, I see different instances in Muslim history, and I see the situations that many of us are living in today. I think about, I live in America, so that's where I am most of the time. I see, what children experience in Islamic schools, for example. When I say children, I mean Black children. I actually did a study, did my master's research. I was looking into Islamic schools because our Islamic schools are trying to do amazing work, and many of them, mashallah, are doing amazing work. But one of the challenges that some of them have, actually, according to the study, many of them have, is how children are treated based on their ethnic background or their color or the language they speak. And these are all things that our deen has solutions for. And so one of the reasons why I decided that I want to work on it is that it's not hard actually for Muslims to address this issue, but it takes a lot of humility and a lot of inner work to say, you know what, we actually have a challenge in how we see Blackness, and it's something that we need to be truthful about and address and really look and see, what does this deen really teach us about this, and how do we rectify our behavior so we become more in alignment with the example that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam lived for us.
MashaAllah. I don't know if other people feel like when they listen to that, they think, I never even thought of that. SubhanAllah, Jazakallah khair, sister. The idea that, Allah has ennobled mankind and it's come down to dignity, and SubhanAllah, our religion has all the solutions. If only we can just be humble enough to, like you say, accept that there's an issue and get some help, get some knowledge about the possible solutions. Something that I also picked up on your website is that you mentioned that a lot of the work you've done, and I'm just mentioning this because a lot of our listeners are mothers, so a lot of the work you've done has been inspired by something that maybe your children said in the home or something that they've experienced in their lives. Is there anything that you could share, obviously nothing too personal, but anything that you'd feel comfortable sharing in that respect, that might help to inspire other mothers to take action?
The reality is, I think as moms, we know this, our children are watching us all the time, and they have such great memories, especially things we don't want them to remember. So I think it's important for us to really be, whatever it is that we want for our children, for us to try to live that. And I want my children, mashallah, to use the gift of creativity that Allah Ta'ala has blessed them with. I want them to be hardworking. I want them to be patient. I want them to, when they start something, to really see it to the end, inshallah, to the best of their ability. These are all the things I want them to do. And I say this to them, but I also want to live that myself. When I see an issue, you want to do something about it. And I'm going to use the word even, because dua isn't an even. It's the great thing to do. But even making dua, like engaging in dua when you see a problem, is the first is one great step that we can take towards addressing issues in our society. And the challenge I see a lot around me, sadly, is that we want to bury our heads in the ground, in the sand, and act like it doesn't exist. And we think, okay, if we don't talk about it, then it's not going to impact us. The reality is, all of these things are happening, and our children are seeing them, they're experiencing them. Sometimes they know how to articulate what they're seeing. Sometimes they might not, but there's certain things they might say that help us understand that they are experiencing the things that we see. They need help with processing it. They need help with understanding what exactly is going on. How do we as Muslims see this event? And I think back to, the murder of George Floyd, and the Muslim community and much of the society was really very concerned about how Black lives were treated, and the idea is that, do we really value Black lives? And I want to go back to think about the word anti-Blackness, the definition that I use. And I think it's really important to have definitions, because sometimes people hear me use that term, they get very shocked, like, oh, what are you saying? What are you trying to imply? What do you so I'm like, let me be really direct about what it means. The definition I'd like to use is by a professor at Northwestern University in Chicago, Dr. Kehana Ross. And she talks about the inability to see and value Black humanity. And this is one of the ideas upon which enslavement was established. Because if you don't see the humanity in a person, it's not difficult to then treat that person as a commodity. And all of the horrors that we know came with that particular industry, that was in the Americas, but also spanned, much of the world. One thing that I noticed with my children, go back to instances of my children, is that I try to cultivate an environment of curiosity and just talking about the things that we see. And that way I can understand, okay, what's actually going on with them? What are they thinking about? What are they experiencing? And the more that they open up and talk about things, the more you can actually address these issues, and also help them with shaping a more of a Quranic worldview. Because I think many of us want that for our children. We want them to see the world, in a certain way. But we're living in a society where everything is presenting a different narrative. The narrative that's being presented is very different from, what the Quran teaches and what Rasulullah lived. But if we really engage in these conversations with our children, and we even letting them know sometimes, like, what, I made a mistake with that, or being very truthful about it, but saying to them, like, one thing I did a lot with my children, especially when they're younger, is telling them lots of stories from the Sirah and the Shama'il, because I wanted them to have that anchor, that no matter what is around them, even if I make a mistake, they have Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and they know, okay, this is what we're supposed to do. And I feel like, just trying to understand like social issues are real issues. And we do have to have conversations with our children because they're experiencing things. People say things to them at school and, when they see, they see things in books. And, these are things that it's very real for them, even if they're not talking about it. And one thing I would encourage a lot of our moms to do is to have conversations, especially when things are happening, things are going on in the news, or even if they're not, you're reading a book, you see certain characters, engaging in behavior that is unkind, that is sometimes race related, or it's an aspect, you see an aspect of anti-blackness being shown there. It's just talking to them and saying, have you ever seen anything like that? What do you think about that? And just to kind of gauge where they are, because sometimes we have a certain way of seeing the world, and they're not even looking at it like that. But having these kind of conversations, we can see, okay, how do we help them shape their understanding of things, inshallah.
And sometimes children see things even more clearly than we do. We can learn so much from our children. I know I've had that experience as well, and I think that's valuable advice to everybody listening, inshallah, to just start having more conversations about these topics with our kids. So you did mention that.
What I was going to say though is to try don't make it too leading, because they're seeing like all these horrors and worried about it, but they might see it very differently. And even if they are seeing things and they're worried about it, being able to address exactly what their concerns are, make it a bit easier for them to manage than it being this big problem of, and this is what happened in history and this and this and that. Whereas it might be a lot for a child to process. Whereas there's a particular thing they've noticed or a book you're reading, you can give some context, to help them understand, what they're seeing. So it isn't just a case, I just read a book. And I say this because I remember there was one particular book that I was reading, and it was about segregation in America. And the way the author presented it, it made it sound like both sides, i.e. the white community and the black community, were equally invested in this institution. And a lot of people don't understand is a lot of black families, the only reason why they might say to the children not to engage a certain way is just out of protection, because you could do the wrong thing or say the wrong thing, and your family can be hurt as a result of that. So when we see things in history, it's like really trying to understand the context of why the story is being told in that way, and just trying to understand it. So when your children are reading, you help them understand that this is what actually was happening, and obviously you have to do it in an age appropriate way so that you don't scar them, but you want to also help them understand that, okay, but how do we act as Muslims? How are we supposed to be? And when someone comes into our masjid we haven't seen before, we make sure we smile. We say, just little things like that, so they understand that there's a role that they can play in making the world a kinder space, inshallah.
So you don't try to avoid those kind of books then with your children, because many of the classics will have things in there that are just not they're just not okay. Let's just put it that way. And a lot of people just avoid classical works that have acts of racism or something like that in there, or they completely sort of boycott authors that have been known to be racist. And what are your thoughts then about boycotting an author or avoiding certain books with children, or do you just go for it head on and have those conversations?
So I think it depends on the age of the child. I'm really a proponent of, having a child almost like a cocoon when they're quite young. It's almost like the idea of having a seedling and it being in a greenhouse, in order to protect it for a while before you actually transplant it into the garden, right? I think that's a good idea. But I think when the child gets a certain age, especially when they're seeing things around them, like 8, 9 years old, being able to have conversations with them and have, like, for example, say you're learning about enslavement in history, right? Instead of just reading a book or avoiding the topic, talking about it, but also giving the perspective of bringing in what were African kingdoms like at that time period? What was Islamic studies like in that time period? Giving an idea of, like, this is a bigger picture. The story of the continent of Africa is a bigger picture than just enslavement. Because for many of our children, especially if you go through the school system, or even if you're following a curriculum that you're not in the actual school, but you're following a regular curriculum, it will tell you a story where you feel that, like the Black community emerged solely out of either colonization or enslavement, without really looking at the actual history of this land. And this is done to other communities too, sadly. But I see it a bit more with the Black community, and I think part of it is just it's just an easier story to tell. This happened and that happened, and that's the end of it. But I would say, like, and especially as Muslim families, bringing out stories, for example, of Mansa Musa, or people like, Sheikh Uthman Dan Fodio, or people like Sheikh Ahmadu Bamba, like all of these like different stories of different, erudite, scholarly, men and women who loved this deen deeply, who taught it, who found ways to help their community, better their knowledge, better their own Islamic knowledge. I think it's important to give our children these sort of stories, especially when they're little, so that when they hear other stories of Blackness, they realize that just like in any society, there's a complexity here, and it isn't just a single story. That's what I would say. But I do think there are certain books that do not really serve. It doesn't really serve our families or much outside of that. So those kind of books I would avoid, but but I wouldn't avoid the actual topic itself. But it would really based on the author, the angle they're coming from, and how they're presenting the information. That's kind of how I would look at that particular issue of, do you go with a book or not?
I see, yeah. I mean, you, mashallah, you have published an award-winning activity book. And you mentioned there Sheikh Ahmadu Bamba, so the book's about Sheikh Ahmadu Bamba. And you also have been teaching online courses about the lives of Muslim heroes. You mentioned some of them there. What I noticed is that these stories that you tell, they are, correct me if I'm wrong, but they're typically about men and women from more recent times. Typically what we will see is that books about Islamic history are, telling children stories about the Sahaba, about figures from, a millennia ago. And alhamdulillah, those are, mashallah, very important stories. But rarely do our children hear stories from more recent figures. Is there a reason why you chose to do this?
So one of the reasons why I chose more recent figures is that there's certain certain events in history, for example, colonization, that happened in more recent history. And our children need to understand what that was and how Muslims navigated it. And I think it's powerful to be able to give these kind of stories of how different, communities dealt with those challenges. So as they're going through different things, as they're getting older, they're getting ideas of how to navigate challenge. And the reality is, our stories of the past are full of different challenges there, and they're learning from them. But also, when you go into stories that are more close to the present day, you're seeing how things that they're learning in history, how Muslims navigated that. And I think it's important for our children to have that knowledge. And what I would love to see is, stories from so many different parts of the Muslim world, whether it's Southeast Asia, Turkey, Bosnia, I mean, all of these lands, West Africa, East Africa, Central, when all of these lands have amazing figures, amazing men and women that came out of these lands. Because wherever Islam spreads, knowledge spreads, a commitment to knowledge spreads. But our children don't always know this because the books that they're exposed to, or the information they're given, doesn't really present this to them. And what I would love for us to do, especially as mothers, is to learn more about stories from around the Muslim world, stories from the millennia ago, as well as stories from the last 100 or 200 years, so that as we're filling our children with all of this information, we're letting them know that there's so many possibilities, and we're hit with different situations. This is how some great men and women navigated these things. It gives them a sense of who they are, and this is why it's very important, because for many of our children, they live in a society that doesn't always embrace them it doesn't always embrace them. But if they have a full understanding of who they are ethnically, like the story of their ancestry, the story of their language group, the story of different Muslim groups, they realize that, wow, there are so many amazing stories. And this is all part of who I am as a Muslim child. Maybe I'm from my parents or my grandparents or great grandparents are from Pakistan. However, I'm a Muslim, and I honor that lineage that Allah Ta'ala blessed me with, i.e. the lineage from my great grandparents, my grandparents, but also I have the lineage of the Prophet ﷺ and the Ahlul Bayt. I have the lineage of the great scholars from around the world, but I also have the stories of Muslims from all over the world, because their story is a reflection of my story too. And this is why stories are so important, whether it's those stories from a long time ago or more recent, just so that we give our children a bigger picture of who they are and what the possibilities for their lives, as well, inshallah.
I just want to say that phrase is so perfect and deep. I'm going to have to reflect on this. You said, their story is a reflection of my story too. I'm going to have to think on that for a while. Mashallah, jazakallah khair. So you mentioned that we should, as mothers, be telling our children more about these amazing figures from our heritage, from our history. Can you give us an example and maybe a brief story of one of the Muslim heroes that you teach children about, so that we can then go on and teach that to our children?
One of the stories that I think is really interesting, as it was a beautiful story to tell, is the story of Malcolm X. And many of us probably have heard his story, but there's two incidences that I really enjoy telling children, because one is when he was in middle school, and for children, it kind of resonates with them, and you might be familiar with the story already. But I think it's an important story because sometimes children experience this either in, an educational space or some other space where somebody doesn't believe in their ability. And this is what happened with him. He's in class and his teacher asks him, what do you want to do? What do you want to be when you grow up? And he says, a lawyer. And his teacher looks at him and says, well, that's not a realistic, career for somebody like you. Well, he was a bit more explicit using the, explicit language, but just for our audiences, this is what he was trying to say to him. As a Black person, that's not something that you can do. And Malcolm was really shocked by this, because this wasn't a teacher who disliked him. This wasn't a teacher who had ever mistreated him. But he understood that teacher didn't see his potential. He just saw him as, all he could see was the limitations that society has placed historically on the Black community. And this shook him, because in the classroom, the teacher would ask students all the time what they wanted to do, and he would always encourage them. And this is the time period where a lot of girls weren't going into professions. But when they said they wanted to do things like become a nurse or something like that, he would encourage them. Or if boys said they wanted to, many of the children who came from farming families, if they wanted to do something outside of farming, he would encourage them. So he knew that the teacher had a capacity to encourage, but he didn't experience that from his teacher. And this is what made him almost give up on himself and on school. And we know his story about, what happens after that. But then he has this experience of being connected to a mentor who reawakens this love of learning, and he reconnects with the idea of really valuing himself and his community. And then we get to the other second story. I love to tell the story of Hajj, and many of us know the story, but I think what's really powerful in the story is how when he meets Muslims on Hajj, he meets people who look just like white Americans, i.e. the same complexion, but such a different attitude to life and an attitude towards him. Because growing up in America, he was always met with disdain and disrespect from the white community. And there's so many different reasons for that. As we read in our history books, we understand the reasons for that. But then he came, into the Muslim world, and he met people who just looked just like that, but had a totally different way of interacting with him with humility, with kindness, with respect. He really felt seen and valued by them. And we have to ask ourselves, and the reason I love the story is that, because sometimes many of us pat ourselves on the back when we hear this story, think, oh, Islam, mashallah, and Islam is mashallah, right? But the lesson I want people to take home here is, are we that kind of person that makes a Black Muslim or a Black person who isn't Muslim feel valued and loved and respected? Do we do that in our spaces? Do we do that in our businesses? Do we do that in our homeschool co-ops or in our schools or in any space that we have control over? And if we're not, we have to say to ourselves, then what are we mimicking? What kind of behavior are we exhibiting? And what do we want? And I say Black community, not to exclude any other community, because not all communities, we have to address our issues with all of them. But I say this specifically because of the history with, in this particular situation. We have to ask ourselves, how are we? How do we measure up? And whenever we read the stories or hear about these stories, we have to also ask ourselves, what would we do? And actually, when I teach children, I always get them to think about, well, what if you had the power or the authority or the influence to be in control of this situation or that situation? What would you do? Because it's easy sometimes to see someone else engage in something that isn't right and say, oh, those people didn't know any better, or they just did the wrong thing. We don't see our own selves in the mistakes that we make, or the arrogance that we carry within our hearts, and the importance of really focusing on that. And that's why when I think about these kind of books, it's a change that starts inward and goes outward, inshallah. It's us really reading these stories, learning about them and thinking to ourselves, what do we apply to our own lives? How do we, what do we bring into our homes that reflects the lessons from this story?
Oh, Jazakallah khair. And, that actually brings me really nicely on to something that I wanted to talk about, is that your work, it brings together these two concepts here of what you're talking about there is looking inwardly and thinking deeply about your own state. You bring together issue that is anti-blackness with tasawwuf, with spirituality. And when I first, came across that in your work, I'd never heard that idea before, but actually, subhanAllah, it makes perfect sense. So can you tell us a little more about this, how you link together anti-blackness with spirituality, and just explain that to our listeners?
The first time I started teaching this was back in 2019. And the reason why I did it was because I noticed amongst the women that was around, they were amazing women, they loved the deen and very kind, but they didn't really understand much about Black history or why, why things were the way they were. That's in America specifically. And I thought to myself, how do we help a Muslim woman who's like, kind-hearted Muslim woman to have more empathy so that when she engages in her dua and makes dua for our ummah, she also includes the spaces that we're in, like America or the UK, places that people don't usually think of. We think of, we're going to make dua for, the Muslim lands, but we don't understand that our dua is one of the most powerful gifts that we have. And that dua can, we can't put a limit on what that dua can do. And I really wanted to engage, believing women who, get up for tahajjud, and women of prayer and dhikr and Quran, to really understand social issues, especially things that are going on in their own communities that can impact them, either directly or indirectly, to really, for them to be involved in this and to bring it to mind when they make dua. And I think in terms of being involved, it's going to be different for different people. So I'm not really like calling to people to, okay, you have to join this organization, you have to do this, do that. It's not really about that. It's really about caring. Because once you care about something, then it's something that you're going to be concerned about. You're going to find ways to serve those issues. So when I started the course, when I first did it, I was reading a lot of, different books because my background isn't social sciences. So I was reading books about, white fragility and white supremacy and white fragility and things like that. And I was using those kind of terms. And I realized that because I was working with Muslim women, a few of the women were white, but many of them were not. And it's easy when you have those kind of terms to think, oh, it's just the white community, not recognizing that anyone can be susceptible to the diseases of the heart that drive anti-blackness. And we go back to the story of, Iblis and that, resentment that he had towards Adam, because he wanted the position of Khalifa. He felt that he was more deserving, and that human beings, or Adam specifically, did not deserve that. So he had this resentment and a commitment to, pulling him down and showing that he wasn't worthy. And this is something that, we know the statement that he made, I'm better than him, because he felt that what he was made from was a superior material to what, our father Adam was made from. So he was the first, I guess you would say, we engaged in that sort of behavior, and really helping us understand that when we start to address these issues, to really address them, it has to start in the heart. Because if not, we're just going to look outside and say, oh, that person did this, and that person, and that's why I said the problem with using all those terms was that I felt that it was then easier for us as a community to look at it as a problem outside of ourselves and not look within to solve it. And this is why I thought to myself, well, what do I want people to do? I'm talking about what I don't want them to be engaged in. What do I want? And I started thinking about, how when we talk about the purification of the heart, our scholars say that it's about, removing those blameworthy traits, right? Those traits of things like, pride and arrogance, resentments and greed, and replacing them with the praiseworthy traits of humility, of, love of God and, repentance and things like that. So I thought to myself, subhanAllah, this is a framework that can be used for any social issue, not just anti-blackness, but I thought, okay, I'm going to use this as a way of helping students understand the issues around anti-blackness and how we can begin to address them. And that's the connection that was made. So really, I see this, I don't see it as like a social justice class or anything like that. I really see it as applied to Tasawwuf. This is just us taking the teachings that our teachers have given us regarding purifying the heart to social issues, as to how we treat people who aren't maybe in our immediate family, people that we might not always interact with, but really preparing our hearts and recognizing that society puts narratives out there. That's the truth. We have all these narratives about Muslim women, i.e. Muslim women are XYZ. People from this part of the world are ABC. And the same thing is with the Black community. There's certain narratives that are put out about what the Black community is and who they are. And we have to recognize that to really know somebody, you have to interact with that community. And that's something I've seen with Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, is that he had real interactions with so many different communities, including people who are Black. You think about Baraka Ayman, who was referred to as his mother after his mother, was an East African woman. You think about Sayyidina Bilal, was from East Africa as well. And there were others, amongst the Sahaba. And when we look at his story where he has real interaction with different types of people. You can see this in the Shama'il and the Hadith literature. And he's teaching us, the lesson I see in that is that we have to be in community with different people too, so that we understand that our ummah, mashallah, we're people of la ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah, right? And if somebody has made that commitment to this faith, they are brothers and sisters. And one of the ways we teach our children that is the way we interact when we are in our masjids or our spaces or wherever we are, and making sure that we create spaces that are welcoming to anyone in the community, but specifically anybody who is mistreated in society or is looked down in society.
A lot of the women who are listening are mothers, so that they're thinking right now, I'm on board. This is what the sister's saying is correct. I want to go with this, but how do I implement this in my home with my children? How can I help my children to overcome these obstacles, address these obstacles within our homes? What can we do? And you've already mentioned this idea of just having conversations around these topics. Is there anything else that they can go away with today and perhaps even implement in their homes today?
I'm going to share some things I actually wrote about this, which is not on the website yet, but I need to add it. But I'm going to share some things because I think it's important for us, first of all, to be to be present with this issue and to try to understand what it is. Because it's hard to address something if we don't understand what it is. So I think as adults, it's important for us to at least understand what the issues are. And also engage in introspection and just think to yourself, okay, where am I on this? Because as mothers, one of the most powerful teaching tools that we have is our own behavior and the way we speak about what we speak about and how we speak and how we act and who we interact with. So it has to start with that introspection of the self, right? And sincerity. And just being really open that and asking Allah Ta'ala that this isn't something I thought about before, but I do want to understand it. And I want to understand how to really be somebody of safety. Because you think about Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam taught that the Muslim is the one you're safe from their hand and their tongue. When we're mistreating people aren't safe from us. So that's the first thing, is really that idea of just being willing to engage in introspection and that sincerity. Like, okay, I'm going to do this. And I'm going to tell a short story, and I'm not going to mention names because historians say different things about it, but it's a true event, but the names, historians differ a little bit on it. But you had instances of two of the companions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and one of them referred to the other as son of a Black woman. And the person who was referred to in this way went to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and told him. And when he was told, Rasulullah was angry. We know Rasulullah doesn't get angry except for things that involve the rights of others and things that are serious in that sense. So when the Sahaba that mentioned this make the statement got to Rasulullah, he could tell that there was something wrong. So Rasulullah, he talked to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam told him that you have some jahiliyyah in you. And this man then goes and rectifies. So Jahiliyyah is really an expression of arrogance, to be honest. I mean, it's so many different things, but the root of it is arrogance. So he goes to the companion that he had offended. He had said something disrespectful and unkind to, and he expresses humility by placing himself on the ground you know. And so, and the story goes. But the point I'm making of the story is that both of these people were beloved to the Prophet ﷺ, and the Sahaba who who rectified his behavior is somebody who is, you know, some of the scholars say about him that half of his tribe became Muslim through him. He's a great person, you know. So sometimes we think that, oh, it's only people who are bad who can make mistakes or do things that aren't right. The sign of his greatness here is that he doesn't start to argue with the Prophet and say, well, I didn't mean that, and it's just a statement, and he rectifies it. And you just see that humility that this particular companion shows, and a desire to want to be better. And we see the Prophet loved him deeply, because when you love somebody, you want for them to be the best version of themselves, so they can they can rectify any errors, so that they don't, these things are fixed in this world. So when I think about this story, I see that Prophet ﷺ addressing an issue that for us, we might say is a difficult conversation. It's not difficult for Rasulullah ﷺ. He was born, he was created to give us solutions to how to live our lives and how to be, true human beings. But in terms of us, it's a difficult conversation. We have to tell somebody there's something, there's some jahiliyyah. It's, it's something that can be seen as difficult if a regular person had to have that conversation. He also is he states what it is. He's very, and I think for us, we have to recognize that we have to state these things. Like, okay, this is what the problem is. And then when the Sahaba himself, he goes and rectifies. So in this story, we're seeing that doing something wrong doesn't indicate that you're a bad person. It just means that you've made a mistake. And the thing about this deen, and the thing about Tawbah, the gift of Tawbah, is you can rectify it at any minute. Because I know for some people, it's hard for them to address something like anti-blackness, because it's then acknowledging that, okay, we're making mistakes, there's a problem with our community, and we get stuck there. Instead of recognizing that, okay, there is a problem, but it doesn't have to remain. It's not the essence of who we are. It's just an attribute. It's an action that we engaged in, or thought, or whatever it is. It can be changed. It can be fixed. And we have to understand that this deen, mashallah, is such that we can always turn back to our Lord. And our mistakes is not a reflection of our goodness. It's an error. It needs to be fixed, and we just have to work on ourselves. And that's why I think for when I think about mothers and families and communities wanting to address this issue, is first of all just recognizing that, alhamdulillah, Allah Ta'ala gives us the ability to fix the issues that our community has. We have to not tie to our identity, not to think, oh, well, does that mean I'm racist? And people get caught up in that word and not really focusing on, okay, what needs to be done. It's not really about, being stuck, because it becomes like an identity, and then we don't want to let go of it. Whereas what I'm saying here is just recognizing that we've been doing things the wrong way. We want to change. Okay. So in terms of our children, I would say instilling respect for humanity. We have to do that. I know, because I hear children say things like, oh, those kuffar. And I think is that it's a true statement. But when we say it like that, it's very dismissive. And you can't, care about somebody enough to do dawah to them if you're just looking down on them. So we have to teach our children to have respect for humanity. And it doesn't mean that whatever person engages in, our children then agrees and co-signs. There's a difference between respect and just anything goes. But being able to teach them that human beings have dignity. And part of our responsibility is to treat people like that, regardless of whether they've answered the call or they're yet to answer the call. We're all the path of the Ummah of the Prophet ﷺ. All of us in creation, all of us human beings, we all are, whether we've answered the call yet or not. So just being able to just raise our children with that understanding, and then being able to help them understand that having these discussions about unfairness and unkindness that they see around them. So when you notice something, even between siblings, and this might not be about anti-blackness, but there's certain principles that when our children understand, they can transfer that. It's like transferring knowledge. They can transfer it to the particular issue of anti-blackness or any other issue our society is looking at. Is talking to them and helping them understand that, that particular thing wasn't kind. And, we know, and reminding them of their kindness and the goodness that they have within them, so that they know that whatever they're doing isn't a reflection of who they are in their essence, but it's something that just needs to be fixed. So doing that. And then I would say bringing in, especially for younger children, having picture books from different cultures, in particular, Black different Black cultures, and not and I would say to be careful as well, because some books are very good at reinforcing stereotypes. So I'd say, trying to look for things that are really uplifting. If you don't, if you're not interacting with the Black community, they might not actually have Black peers that they're playing with. But at least those books will give them the idea that, oh wow, these children are just like, my brothers and sisters, my cousins and my friends. And that when they meet somebody, there isn't this case of staring at them and asking them, are you Muslim? And not testing them. And these are things that happen, where children say all kinds of really, I won't say it's unkind, because I don't think the children mean it like that, but it comes off like that because they're not exposed and they don't realize that this gift or this deen is for all humanity. So you're going to find people from all over the world who are Muslim. So you meet them, the question isn't, well, are you Muslim or are you this or that? But it's like, oh, mashallah, I've been learning this about Islam, I learned this about the Quran, and then sharing, that person probably will share with you too. Teaching them that we are brothers and sisters, right? And then also I would say teaching, so I put American history here because I talk to the American audience a lot, but I'm saying Black British history. There's a lot of history in this country that's important for our children to know as Muslim children, regardless of their ethnic background, because it's part of the history of this land. And usually our schools don't always include this information. And it's important for them to know this history. And I would say also teaching about Black resistance, because when we teach about enslavement, for example, we usually, it's a story of passivity, the Black community being very passive. That isn't really an accurate story. There's so many examples of resistance. Some of the resistance was very creative. Some of it was very direct in that there were uprisings. Some of it was, there was such a range of different sorts of ways of dealing with the horrors of enslavement or the horrors of colonization or any of these particular instances. And one particular story that I'm not going to go into detail about, but I think is important for us to be familiar with, is the abolition of enslavement in West Africa. There was a particular Qadi, Abdul Qadir Khan, who actually abolished it in the area that he ruled in Senegambia, because it came to his knowledge that the brutality of that enslavement, what was happening. Because as you know, many different societies had different forms of servitude and enslavement, right? But the kind of the institution that evolved in America was just something that was beyond anything humanity really has seen up until that point. And as he understood this, he stopped it. But then we had, different European countries fighting him actually for a number of years because they wanted to have access. Because so much money was being made through this industry that they were like, no, you don't get to ban us. And they fought him until they were able to dispose of him and to engage in that form of exploitation and oppression. So so my main takeaway advice is really, it starts with the mother, is recognizing that this is something I have to work on. Because if the mom doesn't believe it's something of importance, no matter what you say to the child, it's not really going to hit. But if you're seeing that, what, when I go to the masjid, this is what I see. And I'll tell you a story. I went to the masjid recently, and I was with, I went with my family, and one of the children said to me, because we went into the masjid, and we weren't sure where we were going because it was a masjid that was new to us. And alhamdulillah, we had it was a fun experience. But when we left, he said to me that when we went in, I thought they were going to throw us out, and I thought to myself, what is it in our masjids that will make this young man feel this way, And we have to think, our space is welcoming. I think that's the most important thing. Our space is welcoming. Do we treat our Muslim students, like when we have our madrasas, do we treat all the Muslim students fairly? Do we have procedures and policies that are equally applied to the different children? Even in our co-ops, because some of us might just, have co-ops together. It's like, is anyone being singled out, or, just being aware of how the group dynamics can evolve. And within our homes, I would say definitely stories, whether it's picture books for younger children, for older children, out to having real conversations. Because most of our children, especially if they were 12, 13, 14, they're familiar with police brutality because it's very real. It's on the news, people are talking about it. Having conversations with them, because when we're silent about these issues, all we tell our children is one of three things, or so either of two things. We don't care, it's not important, okay? Or that Islam has nothing to say about injustice around us. And the reality is, neither of these are true. We do care about humanity. Islam has, frameworks that can address the problems around us. But if we're not using them, if we're not talking about it, if we're not addressing it, it can make our young people feel like, well, I guess Islam has something to offer. So if I care about, fairness in society, I've got to go and join this other organization, or I've got to go be part of this particular group because they care. And as you know, when our young people, especially our, adolescents, they care deeply about justice. They when they see things are unfair, it speaks to them and they want to do something about it. So I think it's really important that we as a community are talking about these issues, inshallah.
Absolutely. I just want to come back to that thing that you've mentioned this a few times, and I think it's worth repeating one more time, is that as the mother, we are the example, and and I love that you've mentioned that it starts with us. It starts with really looking into our own hearts and fixing the issues we have before we start trying to fix what else is going on in our home. I think that's really valuable. And a lot of people will be listening and saying, okay, how do I do that? How do I go about looking at myself and thinking, okay, I've got an issue here. How do I fix it? I know that you have a few programs coming up this year. One of them is for mothers who want to address the spiritual ailments, that is anti-blackness. And another one is for Muslim leaders. So could you tell us a little bit about those two programs that you have coming up?
So one of the things I see is coaching as a really helpful tool to help people go through a process of change. When you're engaged in change, part of it is going to be you learning and reading and talking about things, but also you're thinking to yourself, okay, what are my goals? Where do I want to be? Where am I right now? And when you're on that process of, in that journey of introspection, it helps to have someone help you along with it. Like, okay, start to list what your goals are. This time next year, what kind of space do you want your homeschool space to look like? What kind of books do you want to make sure you have in there? What kind of connections do you want to have in the community so your children are, really being, really in community with other children, including children who are, who aren't from their ethnic background, for example. These might be some goals. And then you're recognizing your obstacles. Oh, these are my obstacles. And once you've gone through that process of understanding where you want to go to, what are some things that can stop you, being able to chart the path becomes easier. And this is, and then doing it in community helps as well, because you realize that, oh, it's not, I have help with this. There are other people who are going through this as well. So this is what we're doing. So I have like I said, the two groups. We have ones for leaders who want to bring this into the institutions. And then we have one for mums who also want to work with other mothers to say, okay, we want to make sure that we give, alhamdulillah, our parents did a lot to raise us, but we want to do even more for our own children. And these are the kind of goals that we want to have, or at least these are my individual goals. And you're working with, maybe 7, 8, 9 other women who also have goals of, what do we want for our children? What kind of prophetic environment we want for them to see and experience so that they can begin to actualize the kind of goals that we have for our family, inshallah.
Definitely coaching is very powerful when you have that kind of support, not just from yourself, but from other students who are maybe in a similar situation to you, and you're doing things together. You see that people, they reach their goals more quickly, and you build a community, and community is so important. So I love that you're doing this as a coaching program. Do you know when enrollment opens for that?
So enrollment's open now, and it will be open for the rest of January, inshallah. So any, mom and the thing is that I don't see being a mom separate from being a community leader, really, because you're leading within your home. You're leading, within the tone that you set in the space that you live in. And I think that's very powerful, because those people you're raising, those children, are going to impact everywhere they go. They're going to take the lessons that you've given them in any space they go into. So I feel like it doesn't have to be just two separate ones, but I did want to have one for moms, because sometimes when you're actively raising young children, you're just in a different space, different season in life. And it's nice to kind of have people on that same, who understand what your day-to-day is like.
Yeah.
And that's why we have the two separate groups. But I welcome any mom who wants to be part of the leadership group, because I think every mother is a leader. And if she doesn't see herself as a leader, she has to embrace that because she is a leader, mashallah, within her home and maybe other spaces too.
So I will put links for those programs in the show notes, as well as Sister Rukayat's activity book. Are you also teaching children? Are you still doing your classes for children, Rukayat?
Alhamdulillah, I am. Not as much as I used to, but what I do now is if I have a group of people who want to work on a particular topic, like for example, I had a homeschool group from California. We went over world history. So if there's a group that wants to do a particular thing, like we do, there's world history. We also do individual historical figures. I also love, the seerah and shama'il. So there's aspects of that we do as well, and also, writing, because one of the things that I do when I teach historical figures is I like to point out some of the styles they use in their writings and get children to think about, okay, let's try that. Let's try this particular method. Like, for example, there's a particular style of poetry called, a takhmis, where it's making 5, where you've got your couplet and you add 3 lines to it to make it 5. And this is something you see, it might exist in other writings, but I see it specifically, I've seen it a lot in West African poetry. West African Islamic poetry. And there's one particular poem I'm thinking of now, which is about the Prophet ﷺ, that was written by, this is about leadership. It was written by Sheikh Uthman Danfodia, who was a scholar born in the 17th century. And he wrote it as a couplet. Then his son came along and added 3 lines. So the same sort of, rhyme and meter and meaning, but he added 3 lines to it. And he did this probably about maybe 40 years after his father wrote it. And then his sister, Sheikh Asma'u, comes along maybe 15 years later and translates it, because the whole thing was written in Arabic, but then she translates it into Hausa, which is the language of the masses. And it becomes very popular because people can, they hear it, they're reciting it. And the way how poetry works in that region is very much spoken, but it's not spoken as in like regular speech. It sounds like poetry. It sounds like, it's being sung, So as people share it, people pick it up, and because it's catchy, it begins to spread. So this is how this particular teaching about what does leadership mean? What does it mean to be a follower? What are the responsibilities? How will one meet their Lord in their judgment when they were a leader? So it's all these things I mentioned in this poem. And it's a really powerful piece, but you see how these 3 family members came together and did it. And I'm thinking, with our children, perhaps having an exercise where you take a particular poem. It might be, the border might be kind of hard, but Midaf Muhammadiyah is I think it'll be easier for children because it talks more about his character traits. And we're taking a couplet from there and then saying to them, would you like to try writing 3 lines? And obviously it's going to be the English translation, unless you're working in Arabic, and then mashallah, you do it in Arabic, and then they can add to it too. And I think part of doing that is it just shows children that mashallah, you can be part of this tradition. It doesn't have to be something that's separate from you. And obviously there's a lot of work that we have to do to kind of reach, to begin to reach where our greats were, but we can begin to work on that, begin to walk that path, inshallah. So that's something that I really love seeing children do. And as a lifelong teacher, it's something that if any group wants to work on that or any of the topics I've mentioned, they can reach out to me on my website, inshallah.
I absolutely love that idea. I've never thought of anything like that before. That's a brilliant idea, mashallah. So yes, if anybody wants to reach out to Sister Rukayat, I will leave her details in the show notes. Before we wrap up, is there anything else you'd like to say or add before we end?
I just want to say, mashallah, I know all of you women who are listening know this. You know that what you're doing is extremely important and the reward is great. But just to remember that, subhanAllah, everything you're doing is setting the foundation for, the future of our community in this country or wherever you are based, in the world. So there's nothing that you do that is small in the sight of your Lord. Alhamdulillah, it's all important. And may Allah Ta'ala bless all of you, the work that you're doing, and increase you and give you all the tools that you need to be able to, hit the goals that you set for yourselves and continue to bless your families. And this is, I love the podcast. I was listening to it and it's such great work. So it's just wonderful to see these kind of initiatives in the community. Alhamdulillah.
Ameen, ameen, ameen. Jazakallah khair. If you enjoyed this episode, remember to give us a 5-star rating wherever you're listening from, and share this episode with your friends in your WhatsApp groups. Share this episode out with your friends. I'll be back next month with another interview, inshallah. So until then, Assalamu alaikum. Sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam.